Major Fenn slapped the briefing table hard enough that the coffee thermoses rattled, and the sound carried through the planning room like a starter pistol nobody had asked to fire. "I don't care what her evaluation sheet says," he said. "A signals warrant officer does not belong on a direct action assessment. I don't care if she volunteered. I don't care who signed the memo." He turned to the two men standing near the projector screen, his voice dropping into something that was almost conversational, almost patient, the way contempt sometimes disguises itself as reason. "We've had 6 Rangers cycle through this qualification sequence in the last 4 hours, 6 of them. And now we're going to let the signal shop try." The laughter that came after was the particular kind that lives in rooms where it has been invited before, where it has been allowed to stay, where it has shaped the furniture of how men talk to one another when women are not supposed to be listening. Staff Sergeant Nadia Brennan was listening. She was standing outside the room's secondary entrance, which was technically a fire egress, which was technically not somewhere a warrant officer should be standing at 0610 on a Thursday morning in a training facility at Fort Lewis. But she had heard the radio traffic 20 minutes ago, same as everyone who had a receiver tuned to the assessment frequency. And she had already made a decision before she fully understood she'd made it. If you are just joining this story, please stay until the end and drop a comment letting us know what part of Canada you're watching from. This story has moved further than I ever expected. The morning had started the way most mornings at the installation started, with the kind of cold that comes off Puget Sound and settles into everything: the tarmac, the tent fabric, the back of your neck if you forgot your balaclava. Brennan had been at her desk since 0430, working through a frequency coordination issue that had been complicating communications across 3 forward positions during the previous week's field exercise. The problem was architectural, not equipment failure, a cascade issue in the relay chain that someone with less patience might have attributed to operator error and left for the next rotation to untangle. Brennan had instead spent 11 days building a revised coordination model in a green notebook she kept beside her keyboard, a notebook she'd had since Fort Huachuca, edge's soft cover creased in the lower left corner where she'd bent it too many times thinking. She was 32 years old, 9 years in the Army. She had a face that people, when they described it later, tended to describe in functional terms: focused, attentive. Not the face of someone performing competence, but the face of someone who simply was not doing anything else. Her hair was pulled back. Her uniform was clean. Her rank was Warrant Officer 2, which meant she existed in the Army's particular institutional purgatory of being technically outside the normal officer hierarchy while being fully subject to it. None of that would matter in about 90 minutes. At 0545, her communications receiver had crackled with the assessment frequency going active. The Ranger Long-Range Patrol Qualification Course had kicked off its final evaluation block, the one that required each candidate to navigate a 3-kilometer route under communications silence, establish a firing position at a designated endpoint, and engage a target at 800 meters with a single round inside a 12-minute window. The catch was that the target was moving, not fast. A mechanized silhouette on a rail system, traversing left to right at a variable pace, speed randomized to prevent candidates from calculating timing before they reached position. You had to read it live. You had to have done the math ahead of arriving, built the model in your head for multiple scenarios, and then adapt in real time to whichever scenario you actually found. 6 Rangers had gone through since 0330. 6 of them had missed. Not by margins that suggested poor marksmanship. The after-action sensor data would later show that each miss was a windage error, a failure to account for the specific crosswind behavior in the valley between the firing ridge and the target rail. The wind at the ridge was calm. The wind in the valley was not, and the valley wind was invisible from the firing position. It was the kind of problem that required you to know it existed before you saw evidence of it, which meant it required prior study, which meant it required the kind of person who did prior study as a reflex rather than a preparation. Major Fenn, who ran the assessment cadre, had been standing at the range control point for 4 hours. He had the look of a man whose certainty about how a morning would go had been quietly eroded by the morning itself, and who had responded to that erosion by becoming more certain, not less. That was when Brennan walked onto the range. She had not intended to make an entrance. She had signed in at the range access point, shown her credentials to the master sergeant on gate duty, and walked to the observation rail behind the control position. She had every intention of watching what happened and leaving without saying a single word. She had not accounted for the possibility that Major Fenn would turn around. Brennan. His voice was the kind of flat that wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite an accusation. This is a closed assessment. What's your clearance level for this range block? Observation access, sir. Sign through at the gate. She kept her voice even. She had been keeping her voice even in rooms like this for 9 years. Several members of the cadre had turned to look at her. A few of the ranger candidates, still waiting their rotation, glanced over. Their expressions varied in the way that expressions vary in rooms where someone unexpected has arrived. From mild curiosity to the particular flatness that comes from having already decided what category a person belongs in. Major Fenn looked at her the way he looked at most things he considered out of place, with a slow assessment that was more performative than analytical. Observation only, Warrant. It was the sentence he'd intended to be the last one. He had already turned partially back toward the range. Colonel Adrian Chalk had not said anything yet. She was standing 3 meters to Fenn's left, which was where she had been standing for the last hour and a half, watching the assessment with the stillness of someone who had learned to gather information before spending it. She was the installation's senior training officer, Fenn's operational superior, and she had the kind of face that gave people no useful information about what she was thinking. She was looking at Brennan now. Brennan looked back at her, not at Fenn. "Colonel," Brennan said, "request permission to run the assessment." The silence that followed was complete in the way that silences are complete when something unexpected has happened and the room hasn't caught up yet. Fenn turned back around. "Brennan, permission to speak to the colonel directly, sir." Fenn's jaw moved. He said nothing. Chalk looked at Brennan for a long moment. She was not the kind of officer who made decisions for effect. "On what basis, Warrant Officer?" "I know why they're missing, ma'am. I ran the signals relay chain for this valley during last week's exercise. I have the wind data. I know where the dead zone is." She paused. "If I can't replicate a hit with that information, I've proven nothing, and you've lost 12 minutes. If I can, you have a data set that explains 6 misses in a single assessment block." Chalk was quiet. Fenn stepped forward. "Colonel, with respect, this isn't a data collection exercise. The assessment integrity. What's your primary MOS, Warrant Officer?" Chalk asked. She was still looking at Brennan. 255A, sir. Information Systems Technician. "And your secondary?" Brennan held the colonel's gaze. "I don't have one on paper." Chalk took that in without changing her expression. Then she said, "Get your kit." Fenn exhaled through his nose. It was not quite a sound, but it was close. Brennan walked back to her vehicle. She had driven down to the range in her own truck, which meant her bag was in the back seat, which meant the case was there too. She took 8 minutes, which included 2 minutes sitting still with her hand on the steering wheel, which was not hesitation. It was calibration. It was the same thing she did before she corrected a complex relay fault, before she rerouted frequency bands under pressure, before she made any decision that had consequences she was going to have to own. She came back carrying a rifle case that was old enough to have been carried onto ranges she wasn't officially supposed to be on. She had bought it secondhand from a retiring master sergeant in Arizona who had never asked her what she planned to use it for, which was one of the reasons she remembered him warmly. The rifle inside was a .308 Winchester bolt action, a platform she had been building and maintaining and shooting on her own time for 7 years. She had started with a used stock and a barrel that needed relapping. She had done the relapping herself. She had modified the trigger assembly over 3 winters until the breakpoint was something she had trained her hands to trust completely. She had taken it to civilian ranges from Washington State to New Mexico on weekends and leave blocks, telling no one in her unit because it had seemed safer that way, simpler, less likely to produce conversations she didn't want to have. One of the ranger candidates, a staff sergeant named Quillen, who had the careful stillness of someone who'd been on enough ranges to stop treating them as performances, looked at the case and said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's not a standard platform for this distance." "No," Brennan said. She was opening the case with the same economy of motion she brought to everything. "It'll work at 800? She looked up at him once. "Yes." Quillen watched her hands. He watched the way she laid the components out, checked the suppressor mount, ran her thumb along the scope turret. He said, in a voice that was a different register from the one he'd been using before, "You've run a target like this? Not this exact configuration." She set the round into the chamber without looking at it. It's similar geometry. He stepped back. He crossed his arms. He waited, which was, Brennan would think later, more courtesy than she had anticipated from any part of that morning. Brennan settled into the firing position she had chosen before she lay down, which was not the position the other candidates had used. They had all taken the obvious ridge crest. She went 6 meters to the left and 2 meters down the slope, which put her slightly below the ridgeline and changed her angle to the valley by 4 degrees. It was a worse sight line in one sense and a significantly better one in another, because from that position she could see the grass movement at the valley's midpoint through her scope. The wind in the valley moved in pulses. She had known this from 11 days of frequency relay work because relay signal behavior in that valley had the same irregular pulse quality that only one thing produced. She had noted it, written it in the green notebook, set it aside as a curiosity. She had retrieved it this morning when she heard the assessment frequency and understood what it meant. She opened the notebook beside her firing position. The cadre behind her went quiet, in the way that rooms went quiet when they weren't sure what they were watching. She heard someone say something low. She did not process the words. She wrote 3 numbers and a correction factor and closed the notebook. She settled her cheek against the stock. She found the rail in the scope. The silhouette was at the left limit of its travel, beginning its pass. She watched the midfield grass. 2 pulses in 14 seconds. She calculated the timing. She breathed. When she squeezed the trigger, the report came back from the ridge face a half-second later. The range sensor crackled. Impact, said the range officer. Center of mass. Confirmed. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Quillen said very quietly, how? It was not a question. Or it was, but not the kind that needed an answer in words. Chalk crossed the range in 9 steps. She stopped in front of Brennan, who was already up from the firing position, dusting the clay off her elbows with 2 efficient passes. Warrant Officer Brennan, Chalk said. Walk me through the correction. So, Brennan did. She opened the green notebook, and she walked the colonel through the valley wind data, the pulse frequency, the timing model, the 4-degree adjustment to the firing angle. She spoke in the same tone she used when she briefed frequency coordination plans, organized, sequential, without editorializing, letting the information carry itself. Chalk listened without interrupting. When Brennan finished, Chalk was quiet for a moment. Then she said, how long have you been tracking wind patterns in this valley? 11 days, ma'am? For the relay work? And the shooting? Brennan looked at her steadily. 7 years, on my own time. Chalk absorbed that. She turned to look at the valley in the direction of the target rail. She was quiet for a moment that had a different quality from her earlier silences. More interior. Why didn't you come through a marksmanship pipeline? She asked. It was not accusatory. It was something closer to genuinely wanting to know. Brennan looked at her directly. The Army wasn't offering me a spot in one, ma'am. The sentence landed in the clean air of the range without softening. Chalk did not flinch from it. She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they've been told something accurate that they can't immediately improve. Major Fenn had not moved from his position near the control point. He had been standing there since the range officer's radio crackled, with the specific stillness of a man whose model of a morning had just been revised without his consent. He was working something out. Brennan could see him working it out. She had been watching that particular expression on that particular category of face for 9 years. The platform she used wasn't range authorized, Fenn said. His voice was measured. Personally modified weapons require prior approval for use on a live fire assessment. The result can't be entered into any official record without a review of the weapons certification. Chalk said, she made the shot, Jordan. Yes, ma'am, she did. But the process produced 6 misses. Chalk turned to look at him. It was not an aggressive turn. It was simply the act of someone reorienting their attention. And then a signals warrant who wasn't on the candidate list walked up and told us why. So I'd like to have a very deliberate conversation about what the process is for. Fenn's mouth opened and closed. He looked for a moment like a man who had arrived at a position he had not prepared for. Brennan said nothing. She had learned, some years back, that the most effective thing she could do in rooms like this was stay still and let the facts do their own work. It was Quillen who broke the silence, and he did it by walking up to Brennan and extending his hand. Staff Sergeant Quillen, he said, that was the clearest wind red I've ever seen on a live moving target. And I've been watching people miss this course for 2 seasons. She shook his hand. It's the valley geometry, she said. The pulse interval is longer near the right terminus. If the other candidates had held until the second pulse, they would have hit, Quillen said. Most of them, she said, probably. 2 more candidates came forward. Then a third, not all of them. There were men at the back of the line who had already constructed their version of what had happened, the version in which this was an anomaly, in which the modified rifle was the real variable, in which something other than what they had actually seen was the explanation. They were working hard to maintain that version, and Brennan understood it because she had watched that version being maintained in rooms and on ranges for 9 years, and she was very familiar with the effort it required. Chalk said, "Brennan, my office. 1,400 hours. Yes, ma'am?" She walked back to her vehicle with her case, drove back to Signals, and then spent the next 4 hours finishing the frequency coordination report that had been sitting open on her screen since ERO 430. She finished it at 12:40. It was correct. It was the kind of correct that came from not accepting approximation as a substitute for precision, which was a standard she had held since she was 23 years old, and had first understood that the difference between a working relay chain and a failed one was usually one number that someone had been willing to estimate instead of measure. At 1400, she walked into Chalk's office and sat without being asked because she had been sitting in chairs. She wasn't invited to sit in since she was old enough to understand that waiting for the invitation was itself a concession she was not prepared to keep making. Chalk was behind her desk, jacket on, a folder open in front of her. She had sent her aide out. Major Fenn filed a formal objection at 1100, she said. He's citing the weapon authorization issue and requesting that this morning's assessment result be flagged as non-standard. I know, Brennan said. He's also contacted someone in the Inspector General's office. I expected that, Chalk looked at her. You don't seem surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm prepared. Brennan paused. Those aren't the same thing. Chalk held her gaze for a moment. Then she opened the folder and turned it so it was facing Brennan across the desk. I drafted this outline this afternoon. Read it. Brennan read it. It took her 6 minutes because she read everything she was given, the way she would read a frequency coordination plan, every line, every dependency, every assumption made explicit before she accepted it as a working document. The outline described a wind and environmental analysis course being proposed for integration into Ranger qualification per screening. A short block, 2 weeks, covering atmospheric pattern reading, environmental signal interpretation, and live fire application under variable conditions. It cited the valley wind problem as the catalyst. It cited 6 assessment failures as the evidence base. It needed a course lead. Brennan looked up. The course lead position requires a transfer out of Signals, Chalk said. Partial reclassification. New training track. Brennan was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know what she wanted to say. Because she was measuring what she was being offered against 17 years of experience with what institutional offers could become once they passed through the layers between the person making them and the people administering them. Who controls the course structure, she said. The Ranger Training Directorate. Not Fenn's shop? Fenn doesn't run the directorate. Chalk said it evenly. I do. Brennan set the folder back on the desk with the same care she set down her notebook after making a ballistic calculation. I'll need to think about this tonight. That's fair, Chalk said. She drove home. She made dinner. She sat at her kitchen table with the outline and her green notebook, and she worked through the course structure the way she worked through relay architecture from the base dependencies upward, testing each layer for load before she built the next one. She worked until 11. Then she closed the notebook and went to sleep and woke up at 0445 because her internal clock had not changed since basic and probably never would. At 0700, she was back in Chalk's office. Yes, she said. Chalk nodded. What happened next was not clean, and it was not fast, and it had the particular friction of any institutional correction that is overdue. Fenn's formal objection went to a review board. The review board included a JAG officer named Delacroix, who was thorough and literal and interested in the exact text of the weapon authorization regulation, which was, as it turned out, regulation that had never been updated to reflect the addition of personally maintained precision platforms to the authorized equipment list, because that category of equipment had never been accounted for in the regulation's original drafting because the people who drafted it had not anticipated the category of person Brennan was. That gap in the regulation was documented in the review. It was not ultimately ruled as a violation. Fenn was not reassigned in the way that Howell had been. He was transferred to a different assessment block, one that did not involve moving targets, which was a lateral move that everyone in the building understood as something more precise than lateral. The course launched its first pilot block 8 weeks after that morning on the range. Quillen was in it. 2 other ranger candidates who had been in the assessment queue were in it. There was also in the back row on the first day a young corporal named Adebayo, 22 years old, who had failed the assessment twice and who sat very straight for the first 90 minutes of environmental pattern instruction, and then, during the first live exercise, read the valley wind correctly on the first attempt. Brennan noticed it without saying anything. She made a note in the green notebook. What she didn't know on that first morning, and wouldn't know for another 3 weeks, was that the frequency relay work she'd done over those 11 days, the work that had accidentally mapped the valley wind, had resolved a communications issue that had been affecting 3 forward patrol elements for 2 months. The battalion's signals officer sent her a short message when the fix was confirmed. It said, "Warrant Officer, I owe you a coffee and an apology for not catching this earlier." She sent back a message that said, "The coffee is fine." The apology she kept. The review board's findings were formally issued on a Wednesday morning. Chalk sent her the document via official channel, the kind of message that arrives in a formatted email and requires a signature of acknowledgement. Brennan signed it at her desk in the signals office, where she still worked in the mornings before the course block ran in the afternoons. Because the frequency coordination work didn't stop just because her schedule had changed, and she had never once in 9 years let one responsibility slide because another one had gotten harder. The findings noted that Warrant Officer Brennan's presence on the range had been authorized through proper channels. They noted that the weapon used, while personally maintained, did not fall under the specific regulatory language invoked in Major Fenn's objection. They noted that the assessment result was confirmed by 2 independent sensors and witnessed by 8 personnel, and that no technical basis existed for setting it aside. They also noted, in a paragraph that Brennan read 3 times, that the wind pattern data she had contributed constituted a substantive improvement to the assessment course's environmental understanding, and that this contribution had been formally acknowledged by the course directorate. The course directorate was Chalk. Quillen found her at the range on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks into the pilot block, when the candidates had finished their individual runs and were cleaning kit. "2 of my guys want to talk to you," he said. He had the manner of someone delivering news he considered self-evidently important. "Off the record. About the wind red." She looked at him. "They ran the valley calculation last night on their own, ran it 4 different ways. They want to know if their adjustment model is right. Send them to my office at 1600. They came. They were both younger than she'd expected, or maybe she was just older than she'd been accounting for. Their model was close. It was missing one variable, the way the wind pulse changed duration near the valley's eastern wall, where the terrain folded back on itself and created a secondary channel. She showed them on a topographic diagram, drew the airflow with a pencil, watched them understand it happening in real time. The one named Adeyemi said, "How did you know to look for a secondary channel?" "Signals," she said. "The relay fade pattern in that area was asymmetric. I went looking for why." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you found a wind problem by fixing a radio problem." "I found it by paying attention," she said. "The medium doesn't matter." He wrote that down. She noticed and did not say anything. There was one conversation she had not been prepared for. It came 6 weeks into the course on a Friday, when she was alone in the range control room after the last candidate had cleared. The door opened and a woman came in, late 40s, civilian clothes, the particular careful stillness of someone who has spent a lot of time composing herself before entering rooms. Her name was Lorraine Quillen. She was the staff sergeant's mother. She had driven 4 hours from Portland, she said. "My son called me. He called me 3 weeks ago." She stopped. She looked at Brennan with the directness of a woman who had not come this far to be indirect. "He said you changed how he thought about the job. He said, specifically, that you're the first person who ever showed him that understanding the environment was the same skill as understanding the target, that you couldn't separate them." Brennan waited. "He was going to leave," Lorraine said. "He hadn't told anyone. He was going to finish this qualification block and put in his papers." She paused. "He's not going to do that now." Brennan looked at her steadily. Your son is a good reader, she said, of terrain, of conditions. He was already doing most of what I showed him. He just didn't have a framework for it. He said you gave him that. The framework was always there, Brennan said. I just named it. Lorraine Quillen looked at her for a moment. Then she said, simply, thank you. It was 2 words, and they had the weight behind them of a decision she had been living inside for a long time, the decision not to ask her son to come home, to trust that what he was doing was worth the distance it cost them, and the terror that came with that trust every single day. Brennan received them the way she received most things, directly, without deflecting. He's doing the right work, she said. I'll make sure he keeps getting better at it. On the last day of the pilot block, she stood at the observation rail and watched all 12 candidates run the valley assessment. 11 of them hit the target. The 12th missed by 11 centimeters, which was a miss on sensor record, and which was also, by a significant margin, the best miss of the entire qualification season. She noted the result in the green notebook. She noted what it meant. The course was going to work, not because she had demonstrated something on a range on a Thursday morning in October that no one had expected to see. It was going to work because the 12 people who had just come through it understood something they hadn't understood before, which was that shooting accurately at moving targets in variable conditions was not primarily a physical skill. It was an observational one. It was the skill of seeing what was actually there, not what you had expected to find. That was the thing she had taught herself in the years when no one had been paying attention. Not the mechanics, though she knew those too. Not the mathematics, though she had worked through those alone. On ranges from Washington to New Mexico on weekends when the rest of her unit was doing other things. She had taught herself how to see what the environment was actually doing, independent of what she wanted it to do, independent of what she'd calculated in advance, independent of what the previous 11 attempts had suggested. She packed her rifle case. She drove back to the signals office. There was a relay configuration that needed reviewing before end of day, and she had told herself she would have it done before 1800. She sat down at her desk, opened the frequency coordination model, and started reading from the beginning. The course would run again in 6 weeks. She had already built the second iteration's outline, revised and extended, with a new segment on low-altitude wind behavior and a field exercise she'd designed, using a different valley on the installation's eastern edge, one with a more complex airflow pattern that would be harder to map and more representative of what candidates would encounter in operational environments. She had already mapped it herself. It had taken 3 weekends and 1 full leave day. In the green notebook, under the last entry from the range that morning, she had written 1 line. It was not a dramatic line, it was a number. It was the average deviation across all 12 final assessment results, adjusted for the environmental conditions of the day, 14 centimeters. Across all 12 candidates, on a moving target at 800 meters, in a crosswind that had defeated every shooter who came through before the course existed. She looked at the number for a moment. Then she turned the page, because there was another assessment block in 4 weeks, another set of candidates who had never thought about valley geometry before, and the next iteration of the outline wasn't going to write itself. She picked up the pen and she started writing.